Okay, so we have a whole bunch of different types of sensory receptors, but they all behave in pretty much the same way, that whatever that sensory receptor is sensitive to, and they're very specific. A photoreceptor is sensitive to light, warmth. Sensory receptor is sensitive to warmth. A baroreceptor is sensitive to pressure. So these sensory receptors are very sensitive to whatever their sensory modality is. But whenever that modality, that sensation is present, you get a change in membrane permeability. And that membrane permeability is going to lead to a receptor potential, a change in electrical charge at the membrane, that if the membrane or the receptor potential is great enough, just like what you saw with graded potentials on dendrites, now we're talking about on sensory nerve endings. If the graded potential is depolarizing enough, it will then activate the sensory neuron. And you know, sometimes you can smell just a little bit of onion, or you can smell a lot of onion, or you can feel a little bit of warmth, or you can feel a lot of warmth. So you know that there's gradation and sensation. So how the heck do you get that gradation and sensation? And it's really, generally speaking, the greater the perturbation, the change in whatever that stimulus is, the greater the permeability change, the greater the receptor potential, so the greater the electrical change at the receptor, and then a greater frequency of action potentials. Remember, you can't make action potentials taller. So you can't make, oh, I don't feel that much, so it must be a little action potential. I feel that a lot, so it must be a very tall action potential. It doesn't work that way. If you have a slight sensation, you just have a few action potentials going along that neural highway. If you have a stronger sensation, you have a whole volley. You have more action potentials. So that's where we get the gradation of sensation, by having more action potentials per unit time. Now, where do you find sensory receptors? Sometimes they're actually found on nerve endings themselves. Sometimes you have specialized receptor cells, and that's where the sensory receptors are. These receptor cells, when they are activated, they will then release neurotransmitters to then, if enough's released, to activate this afferent neuron. Remember, afferent neurons bring information from the periphery to the central nervous system. So here we have just a small amount of sensation, and we just have one action potential racing down here. But what if we have a lot more sensory stimulation? Well, no, it's not taller action potentials, it's more action potentials per unit time. So more of these are going to get to that sensory perception area in your brain, and you're going to go, oh, that's warmer than what it was before. Same thing for right here, when you have these receptor cells. So this could be like an inner hair cell in your ear, or it could be an olfactory cell. You know, there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different places where you have these photoreceptors, is an example here, that you have some stimulus that's going to activate the receptor cell. And just put this in your notes, that receptor cells, they're graded potentials only. They only have graded potentials. They don't have the capability of throwing in action potentials. So this stimulation right here, if it's enough, it can depolarize. Well, I need to be careful. It changes membrane permeability, which changes the electrical potential, and that can determine if you release these neurotransmitters or not. If you release enough, then you're going to activate that afferent neuron, and you will perceive a sensation. So a small amount of stimulus versus a large amount of stimulus. What gives our ability to discriminate sensory intensity is the number of action potentials per minute. Remember, action potentials are all in, so you don't have bigger action potentials. That kind of makes sense? Okay, so here's just a simple idea. This is a Pacinium corpuscle. You have them in your tissues that when you sat down, you compressed some of them. And that told your body, okay, sat down, you relax your legs, you've made contact, you're leaning against the wall. So I just wanted to show you how this works here. So we have, these are mechanoreceptors. These are mechanoreceptors. So they are sensitive to mechanical perturbation. So let's say that there's some pressure on this. That pressure causes a permeability change. In this case, it causes sodium influx. So you are depolarizing the membrane right here. Now, in these myelinated afferent neurons, when they're set up with, here's a sensory nerve ending, this is where we can get a receptor potential. Receptor potentials are like a graded potential. No action potentials here at all, none whatsoever, because you don't have voltage gated, no voltage gated sodium potassium channels here. Where do you have the first voltage gated sodium potassium channels? At the first node. Then you have them at the second node, third node. So no action potentials here, just receptor potentials. But if this drives the membrane right here at the first node to threshold, then you get action potentials, then action potentials will race down that axon. So the greater the mechanical deformation, the greater the electrical change here at the receptor, the greater the receptor potential, the greater chance it's going to keep that first node depolarized longer. And if it's depolarized longer, you'll have more action potentials. Of course, you can't violate the refractory periods, but you can, as soon as you get out of the refractory period, you can fire up another action potential.
Just a quick clarification.
Yeah.
So receptor potentials do have refractory periods?
No, receptor potentials are a form of graded potential.
Okay.
Thanks for bringing this up. So there's no refractory period here, but there'd be refractory periods here, here,
Gotcha.
here.
So could you like overwhelm or have a, I mean, that's pain?
Well, look at this is this 7-2 really studied this in the textbook. Very much studied this. So it's measuring, so a certain amount of stimulation is being applied here to the sensory nerve ending of this neuron. And so here's a little bit of stimulation, here's more stimulation, here's more stimulation. And then you're measuring the voltage just right near where that stimulation is. So right here it's measuring the receptor potential. And here's the first node. And here you're measuring the electrical potential. So here with a little bit of stimulation, yeah, you change membrane permeability and it's depolarized a little bit. So that depolarization is going to spread just like the electrical currents we saw earlier, and it will depolarize the first node somewhat, but it doesn't depolarize it to threshold. Okay? So you can see that, okay, you were getting to refractory periods, but receptor potentials are graded potential, they have no refractory periods. So here we have a little bit more stimulation, so we have a little bit more depolarization with the receptor potential, and that will spread, and that happens to drive it to threshold, so we get some action potentials. And if you get action potentials here, you'll get action potentials here, you'll get action potentials down here in a normal, healthy neuron. Now, if you have a demyelinating disease, like multiple sclerosis, maybe not, but in a normal, healthy person, you get action potentials here, you're going to have action potential sweeping all the way down here. If you have some action potentials, that's going to depolarize these synaptic terminals enough to open up those voltage-gated calcium channels to power that sequence to release some neurotransmitter. But if you have even a greater sensory input, you'll get a greater receptor potential, more action potentials, more release of neurotransmitter. So this response is greater. No neurotransmitter release, some, and more. And you would perceive that. Oh, I feel that, I don't feel that at all. I feel that a little bit. I feel this much more. I sense that much more. So with sensory pathways, there is some gradation. You can sense, oh, a little bit of a sensation or more. Some sensory pathways have huge dynamic ranges of gradation. Other ones have just small. But there is some gradation, and it comes from this type of thing. So this is a three-star figure in really working to understand how this works. Okay? So most sensory receptors will adapt, and many of them will adapt completely, fully, if the activating stimulus remains. So adaptation is when a sensory receptor or its immediate afferent neuron, it becomes less excited over time the longer a stimulus is present. So, you know, you walk into a restaurant and you smell onion and garlic and oregano. You know, let's say you go to an Italian restaurant, and you know you're going there to have dinner with a friend. As usual, your friend is late, so you get there and oh, it smells wonderful. And your friend leaves. You know, it's 10 minutes late. Your friend shows up and says, "Oh my gosh, all the aromas in here." And you go, "You know, I just don't smell them that. You know, you just don't smell it nearly as much as when you first walked in." You step into the shower. Hot. A minute later, not so bad. The temperature of the water probably hasn't changed. You've adapted. So in the face of continuing stimulation, most sensory receptors will adapt. Your body wants to know what's going on, and then if it's not challenging survival, well, let's start filtering that out, and adaptation is part of that. So all mechanoreceptors probably adapt completely given sufficient time. Some mechanoreceptors, like those Pacinian corpuscles, when you set down, they adapt within 2 or 3 seconds. But there are other ones, like your carotid and aortic baroreceptors. They take 48 to 72 hours to adapt. So adaptation is, you're no longer activating that pathway if that sensation is continuing. Sometimes that adaptation is quick, sometimes it's slower. Now, most sensory receptors have noticeable adaptation periods, like taste, smell, thermal regulation, which I just mentioned. I sometimes throw in a slide right here from in New York City. Every other year there's these grand dining events where they're 18-course or 21-course meals at these mini-star restaurants. You know, it's part of the reason why the rest of the world hate us. And they always sell out, and tickets for this like $3,000 to $4,000. And chefs are really good at understanding sensory physiology, because how they vary courses, you use certain taste receptors and olfactory receptors for one course, and then the next course, it's a different set. So you know the first time you take a bite of a dish that you're really looking forward to, that first bite is just sensational. 3 minutes later, it still tastes good, but it's not like that first bite, okay? So with these multi-course meals, it's small portions, and they vary the sensory receptors with different courses. So everything is like, oh my goodness. It's all just 10s for taste and aroma and appreciation and texture. Well, no, they just really know what they're doing. They really know what they're doing. And I've used this on exams before, but there is an air freshener that you can plug into the wall. And you know, air fresheners that plug into the wall, they've been around for 15 years. And every few minutes they put something out. Oh, well, Alpine Forest. You know, it's real nice. There's one out there that's really, really smart. It's 2 different scents. Oh, Alpine Forest. 15 minutes, Spring Meadow. And then it's Alpine Forest. So because they bury it, you never adapt to it, so it always smells fresh. Okay? Now, here, circle this, put 3 stars on it, underline it, whatever. Pain receptors are a sensory receptor. They do not adapt. They do not adapt. This is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing if you can get yourself out of a painful situation. Pain is usually indicative of some type of tissue damage, and it's built into our ancestors that if they can get away from that damaging input, you know, you got a saber-toothed cat biting your rear end, you know, get up a tree. Well, no, they can climb trees. I don't know what you do, but you know, try to get your body out of that damaging situation. That would be the good thing. It's telling you, move. It's a bad thing if you can't do anything about it. Pain receptors continue to fire. Yes?
You talked about before that like pain receptor or pain can be a learned behavior.
Yeah, it becomes sensitized, yes.
So then like if you're, say you have chronic pain and eventually does that pain start to become more and more intense because like your body's telling you to get away from the pain, but you're not
okay,
responding
now
to it?
different pain scenarios are different, but it can become more intense or it can be more easily elicited. You'll still have the same intensity, but it takes less input for the pain to start, or both. But you can literally measure, you can never just look at, with galvanic skin responses and so forth, and measure how much pain a person has. You can have a pretty good idea with certain measures, cardiac responsiveness and so forth. But it is without a doubt that with certain chronic pains, that pathway becomes sensitized and it becomes augmented. So it's easier to activate and it hurts worse. So one of the great pain Margot McCaffrey, she says, pain is what the individual tells you it is, existing when he or she says it does. And because pain is very individualized, yes.
So what about situations like headaches is a good example where people who have chronic headaches or migraines, they almost get used to the pain and like it's just normal for them to have
So,
pain.
you know, there are certain pains that people learn to tolerate by.
So is that like a different system? Like
Not all
toleration?
not all pains can be augmented. Not all pains can be sensitized.
Okay.
Some can. You know, some things with migraines, when people start having them, boy, they go to 10 and that's it.
Yeah.
And then they develop coping behaviors
Right.
to, okay, when this happens, I go into a dark room, it's gotta be quiet, whatever it is. But, you know, there are some that sensitize and other ones, they don't. They just are what they are. It depends on which type of neural pathway. And you're gonna find out pain is really complicated, very complicated. So that's some things about sensory receptors. So we've already talked about nerve fibers. And the thing I want to mention to you is, yeah, when you think about nerve fibers, almost all of us, I know I'm guilty of this, I immediately think of A-alphas, these alpha motor neurons that innervate skeletal muscle, these large diameter, very fast. But when we're talking about pain transmission, we're talking about A-delta nerve fibers, and we're talking about C nerve fibers. So we're going to have an entire section where we talk about pain coming up. So, but you know, having said that, that's for pain. I don't want to just keep this on pain, but we're going to see that A betas are very, very important for some sensory transmission. For example, via the dorsal column medial lemniscal. For some sensations like itch, the C fibers are important. So we use almost all of these different types of nerve fibers for different types of sensation perception. So let's look at the spinal cord. Have you, girls gone through spinal cord anatomy yet?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to talk about it nearly as much as what Dr. Burton talks about. I'm just going to talk about the functional aspects of two different pathways, okay? So there's a whole number of different neural tracts, and as I've already mentioned it, don't just think that the spinal cord are neural tracts ascending up to the brainstem and brain and descending pathways going from the brainstem and brain down. Yes, they have them, and that's what we see here, the ascending sensory afferent tracts. There's also synaptic circuitry built in here for so many different reflexes that's not shown. So these are the ascending tracts. Now we're really only going to focus on a couple, two of the ascending tracts for sensory information. Now the cool thing about, you learn this in anatomy, they tell you where they start and they tell you where they go. So spinal thecule, it starts in the spinal cord and it goes to the thecule area of the brain. The anterior spinal thalamic, it starts in the spine. Where does it terminate? This pathway terminates in the thalamus. So they pretty much tell you in many cases where they started and where they go. And dorsal columns don't really tell you that. So the ascending tracts, what we're going to be focusing on are the dorsal column ascending tract and the anterior and the lateral spinal thalamic tract. And I'm a physiologist. We consider the anterior and lateral spinal thalamic tract as a unit because similar sensations utilize that superhighway. So we're going to talk about the anterolateral spinal thalamic tract. And that anterolateral spinal thalamic tract, think of that as a superhighway with many different lanes. There is a lane that will transmit crude tactile sensation. There'll be lanes, plural, for thermal sensation. There'll be lanes for things like itch and tickle. There will be lanes for sexual sensation. There'll be different lanes for different types of pain.
They're along these tracks.
Pardon me?
You said, so these lanes, they run along the...
Yeah, so within the anterolateral spinal thalamic pathway, you have different areas within them that are dedicated for specific sensory modalities. So just think of this as, tubes running to the back wall, and within those tubes are smaller tubes. Here's one for itch. Here's one for crude tactile sensation. Here's one for warmth thermal sensation.
And these are only ascending pathways?
Well, right now we're just talking about the ascending. When we get to motor, we'll talk about the descending. Yeah. Okay, so we're just going to focus on two of these guys. So we're going to talk about the dorsal column, medial lemniscal pathway. So in the spinal cord, it's the dorsal column, but once we get up to the brainstem, that dorsal column turns into and joins with the medial lemniscal tract in the brainstem. So the dorsal column, medial lemniscal, that's a tract going up the spinal cord and then extending through the brainstem. And then the anterolateral spinal thalamic pathway. These are just the two we're going to talk about. And different types of sensations go up these two different tracks. So here is the big picture of the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. And I'm going to step through it one slide at a time. It doesn't work, I found out, just giving this slide, and we'll go with it. And we have to. So this pathway, the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, has afferent neurons out in the periphery that have sensory receptors that are activated fine touch, vibration, position of the joints, movement against the skin, fine pressure. So this pathway, its sensory receptors are found at the ends of neurons that are on the surface of the skin, inner joints. So this pathway really tells the body a lot about what's happening on the surface of the body and what's happening to the position of the limbs in the body. Want to know what's going on with your interface with the environment and position of your body in space. So, let's say we have an activation of a sensory, so these are almost all mechanoreceptors. So the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway is really big on mechanoreceptors. Movement, vibration, pressure will activate them. So let's say we have some movement, vibration, pressure that will activate the sensory receptor and activate this first, well, this afferent neuron. Remember, afferent neurons, they come in via the dorsal nerve root and they enter into the spinal cord in that dorsal horn. So this is the first neuron in a chain of neurons. So the first neuron in a chain of neurons is called a first order neuron or a first order sensory neuron. And first order is often just abbreviated as 1 with a degree sign. So when we activate one of these sensory neurons, it comes in and it's going to start ascending up the ipsilateral dorsal column. Ipsilateral means same side, same side. So if this sensation is coming from the right side of the body, let's say I'm scratching the back of my, or excuse me, left side of the body, I'm scratching the back of my left hand. That will absolutely activate certain mechanoreceptors there because I can feel it. That afferent neuron, this is part of the peripheral nervous system, it's coming in, it's going to enter into the central nervous system and then turn and pass up through the dorsal column on the same side of the body, left side of the body. So it's projecting superiorly up the ipsilateral dorsal column. And where does it go? It goes up here to the brainstem, up here to the medulla. So up here, this up here is like the pons, this would be the medulla. This came into the spinal cord, here's the brainstem. And in the medulla, it is going to synapse. It's going to release neurotransmitter and stimulate a second neuron in this chain. So the synapse is in the medulla. So, yeah, I should mention this. So it's going up the dorsal column of the spinal cord, and once it gets in the brainstem, then that pathway is called the medial lemniscal pathway. So this is the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. So now it's in the medial lemniscal tract. It is going to synapse with a second order neuron, and what does that second order neuron do? It immediately crosses over to the opposite side of the body and then ascends up and terminates in the contralateral thalamus. So this is a part of the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. So ipsilateral, same side of the body, contralateral, opposite side of the body. So sensations on the back of my left hand are projected up here to the contralateral or right thalamus. Now, with the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, you do have some third order neurons that then project here to the somatosensory cortex. This is here at the surface of your cerebral cortex. So that would be the third neuron in the chain, so it would be called a third order neuron. And this provides something special. When you activate the somatosensory cortex, you have great sensory perception, location discrimination, and intensity discrimination. So you have sensory location and sensory intensity discrimination when you activate this area of the brain. So, Do you think this pathway, when you activate this pathway, you have a pretty good idea without even, with your eyes closed, somebody's back scratching the skin on the back of your left forearm, you know where it is. Because you have, this is projecting to a very specific area that gives you the perception of, oh, there's movement against the back of my forearm, about right there. This gives you great location discrimination. If I were to scratch my shoulder, it would be a different receptor I'd be activating, a different afferent neuron. It would synapse with a different second order neuron. It would activate a different third order neuron, going to the area of my body that corresponds with the shoulder, and I would have shoulder perception. This is what gives us great location discrimination.
It's the actual part of the cortex that gives you that discrimination?
Yes, that somatosensory cortex gives you great sensory discrimination. We'll contrast that with the other one.
So it synapses twice?
Pardon me?
It synapses twice?
It synapses twice. Now, so, do you notice that this first order neuron, part of it's in the peripheral nervous system, part of it's in the central nervous system. So you always contrast and compare with the next one. You see this synapses in, the first synapse is in the medulla, the second synapse is in the contralateral thalamus. So let's, and you know, I should just mention, it's on here, so I'll wait to mention it, but this is composed of pretty high velocity, large myelinated neurons. And many of the neurons for dorsal column, medial and meniscal pathway, and I can't just give you an ironclad answer, but many of them are the A betas. So that's the second largest, second fastest neuron. So think about it, this is really the surface of your skin and where you have a lot of this innervation, your joints. Your body wants to know what's happening in real time, very, very quickly at the surface of your skin, and what's the position of your joints in space, because that keeps you upright and it helps you with equilibrium, because your body is trying to protect your head at all times, keep you from falling down. So this, the crossover to the contralateral side is in the medulla. It travels to the contralateral thalamus via the medulla's medial meniscal tract. You will have third order neurons synapsing with the somatosensory cortex, and that's important. That gives you great sensory discrimination. It's a high velocity pathway, use larger myelinated neurons, a lot of A betas, This gives you highly discrete spatial orientation and location. You can tell exactly, with your eyes closed, where it's happening. And you also have a high degree of sensory signal intensity. You know, somebody's scratching the back of my hand, yeah, I can barely feel it. You scratch a little bit, I feel it more. You scratch hard, I feel it even more. So you have the ability to sense the intensity of that perception. So fine touch, vibration, position of your body, movement against skin, fine pressure. These are the types of sensations that largely utilize this dorsal column medial meniscal pathway. Okay, let's now contrast and compare that with the anterolateral spinal thalamic pathway. So here we have sensory receptors out here, and a whole number of different sensory modalities utilize this pathway. So pain receptors activate neurons that go up this pathway. Thermoreceptors activate sensory receptors that utilize specific lanes of this pathway. Crude tactile sensation, itch, tickle, sexual sensation. All of those sensations are initiated by specific sensory receptors activating specific afferent neurons, going to specific areas in the brain, leading to specific perceptions. So let's say we have activation of some sensory receptor, and here we have a first order neuron coming in. It isn't up in the medulla. The first order neuron synapse is right here in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. And then that activates the second order neuron. That, in this case, it's going up the lateral spinal thalamic tract. This other pathway, it too is synapsing here in the spinal cord, and then crosses over to the contralateral side of the body to ascend up the anterior spinal thalamic tract. So that's a difference. That's a difference between the dorsal column medial lemniscal. The dorsal column, it came in and it ascended up the ipsilateral dorsal column. This is ascending up the contralateral anterolateral spinal thalamic tract. But this is a second order neuron, and similar to what we saw before, second order neurons synapse in the contralateral thalamus. Now, why the heck do I have these hatched lines? Not all sensations that are utilizing the anterolateral spinal thalamic sensory pathway project third order neurons to the somatosensory cortex. Some do, some don't. The ones that do only send a few. So compared to the first, you think you have as good, let's say less or more, or it doesn't make a difference, the ability to sense location. The ability to sense location is much lower when you utilize this pathway. You know, for things like itch and tickle, you know, it's an area that itches. It's an area where you feel the sensation of tickle. It's not one specific spot. That's because of poor innervation of the somatosensory cortex. That kind of makes sense. If you put a piece of metal that's cold on one spot in your hand, back of your hand, if it's very small, you won't be able to tell, is that cold or warm? It's different, but I can't really tell what it is. Now, if you make it a larger probe, then you can, with more information. So contrast and compare what's similar, what's different between these two pathways. So, yeah, there's just very few that go up this. So, with the anterolateral spinal thalamic pathway, this is going up smaller myelinated neuron. Well, some of them are smaller myelinated, but some of these are unmyelinated. That, once again, this pathway, there's a whole number of different lanes. Think of that anterolateral spinal thalamic pathway as a superhighway with many different lanes. And we're going to see that there's a fast pain lane, there's a slow pain lane. Thermal sensation lanes, crude tactile sensation, edge tickle, sexual sensation. So, yeah, the lower degree of special orientation and discrimination, much less intensity discrimination, but a wide variety. You know, with the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, those were all really mechanoreceptive sensations, movement, vibration, pressure. This is a wide variety of different sensations for this pathway. Now, this is the way your book shows it, and it's good. The one thing that I don't really care for is here with the anterolateral spinal thalamic pathway. It makes you, if I would look at this, I would think that all of these pathways project to the somatosensory cortex, and we don't. Some do, sparse innervation, some don't at all. Okay? And the ones that don't at all, for example, something called slow pain, very poor location discrimination. The area hurts, but you can't point to exactly where does it hurt. Your arm hurts. Rather, there's some pains that you'll go, right here it hurts. So, and this is also showing collaterals to the reticular formation. And the reticular formation that's in the brainstem, it does so many things for you. It has so many reflex centers. But one thing I told you is wakefulness and arousal. Okay? So there's a lot of sensations, not all, but there's a lot of sensations that you walk up behind someone and go, when they're not expecting it. They're suddenly very awake. You've been working here very late one night studying, and you get in the car and you're tired. Almost reflexively, you turn the air vent or you roll down the window, cool air in your face. It doesn't keep you awake very long, but it does arouse you a bit, so you're a little bit more awake. Those things don't just happen, they happen because of the neurology. Okay. So, let's look at the somatosensory cortex. It's just posterior to the central sulcus right here. So there is a ridge just behind, just posterior to the central sulcus. That's the somatosensory cortex. Just anterior to it is the primary motor cortex. And the somatosensory cortex, when you have pathways that project to it, you have fine sensory perception as far as location and intensity perception. Now, if you have damage to that area, don't think you won't perceive any sensations at all. No, crude tactile sensations remain. So this tells you something important, that the thalamus itself will give you sensory perception. It's just not as fine, it's not as discriminatory, but it's still sensation. We'll see sensory pathways that terminate in the thalamus. Do you still feel something? Absolutely. It's just a generalized feeling, a generalized sensation, instead of a very specific perception which you get when you activate the somatosensory cortex. And remember, it's laid out like a map, that about a quarter of it is devoted to the head, neck, and oral cavity. So of course the dental students get all excited that nature thinks, boy, the oral cavity is really important, or it wouldn't dedicate this much space to it. You guys are working with your hands and fingers with manual skills right now, and that's about a quarter of that sensory cortex as well. And then you can see, so if you go in and you electrically stimulate, this area right here, that area of the brain. The brain on its surface doesn't have pain receptors. To get to it, you have pain receptors, but there's no pain receptors on the surface of the brain. So if you electrically stimulate certain areas of the brain, the patient will, these surgeries are often done with the patient conscious, because if you do certain types of brain surgeries, the patient needs to be conscious so you can map the brain. We put little flags, they stimulate this area. Okay, that is my left posterior aspect of my little finger. Okay, you map that, and you go through that, and that way they know what to try to preserve and how far they can excise the tissue that needs to be removed. You're going to think I'm a dirty old man because I said, okay, I brought up things that could be perceived as somewhat salacious, and thank you for recording this. But this is one of those things, this is very, very old. You'll see it in the next one, that if you know a little bit about sensory physiology, it's like, well, that's not much of a surprise at all. So there are some people that have intractable pain, that drugs just don't work. So what they do is, and this happens all the time, they implant these electrical stimulators into the spinal cord and other areas, and basically with electrostimulation, you're trying to put that pain pathway into essentially a refractory period the whole time. And that helps block the pain signals using electricity. So, pain goes up the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway or the anterolateral? Anterolateral, okay? And also in the anterolateral, you have pain, you have thermal sensation, sexual sensation, you have crude tactile sensation, I know I'm forgetting one here. Anyway, so you have a lot of different sensory pathways going up the anterolateral spinal fluid pathway. So here there's a woman who was suffering pain. So here this anesthesiologist is inserting this for pain. And so this goes back 12 years, but it really underscores fundamental neurophysiology. So Dr. Malloy, a pain specialist, was putting an electrode into the spine of a female patient with chronic back pain. The woman reported a decrease in her pain and then a delightful but very unexpected side effect. When we turned the power on to the stimulator before they placed it in her skin, she let out a moan and began to hyperventilate. Well, you know, it's like, what's going on? And you know, the anesthesiologist would go, uh-oh, something bad's happening. And he said, of course we cut the power, and I looked around the surgical drapes and I asked her what was going on. Once she caught her breath, she said, you're going to have to teach my husband how to do that. Now, so this was an existing use for this electrostimulator for pain suppression. But this happened to him, and then it happened a second time. You start talking to other anesthesiologists, and they said, yeah, this happened as well with us. And so, and it's too bad, but popular press, when he patented the use of this device for a new medical use, the newspapers and on TV morning shows, this is what he didn't call it this, but doctor discovers the orgasmatron. And so he was involved, and he was just approved. And the reason why this hit the news is he was approved. The FDA required that he implant this in X number of patients, women with what was called primary anorgasmia. No way, no how they could experience an orgasm, which in some people is emotionally very, very taxing and distressing. So FDA required him to put it in something like 20 patients, and here is one of the people, and it's a pretty long article, but they just had it in for, I think it was 16 weeks, and then took it out. And this one woman reported, when I gave it back, I came in the office, and Dr. Malloy took the electrodes out, you know, out of the back, and it was like losing my best friend. It was very hard to give it back. It worked so well for me. So, you know, he was implanting it. Think about this. It's not surprising that this worked the way it did, because the pain pathway and the sexual sensation pathways, they're different lanes of the same anterolateral spinal thalamic tract. So it makes perfect sense that if you don't get the pain pathway just right, you overrun it a little bit, you get into another pathway. And he didn't, when he was just turning it on and turning it off, he didn't put that sexual sensation pathway into refractory period, because he was turning it on, turning it off. He was setting action potentials up. And bottom line, it's now patented for that use, and it is used. It is used. So at the time, it was like, oh my gosh, he hit some special area. If anybody with neurology, anybody who knows anything about neurophysiology goes, well, that's not surprising at all. It's kind of surprising this hadn't happened earlier. You know? So, okay, so now we're going to very briefly go through somatic sensations, and we're going to look at tactile position and thermal, and tactile position in just a couple of slides. So yeah, all this material builds off of part one. So the somatic sensations consist of, I've showed you this before, mechanoreceptive senses, thermoreceptive senses, and pain senses. So let's first look at the mechanoreceptive senses, the tactile senses, and position senses. Some of this is being projected up the dorsal-column-medial meniscal pathway. Some of this is going up the anterolateral spinal pathway. A lot of it's going up the dorsal column. So you do not need, these are the sensory receptors, the tactile receptors at the surface of your body and in the tissues below the surface that tell the body what's going on here at the surface. And there's a bunch of them. There's tactile receptors on free nerve endings, there's Meissner corpuscles, there are expanded tip endings on Merkel disc, hair end organs, Ruffini end organs. You don't need to memorize these at all. I just want you, sorry, don't memorize. I want you to understand your body has so many different types of sensory receptors to know what's going on at the surface and the tissue's just deep to the surface. Really wants to know, because this is your barrier, and you want to know if something bad's happening. And also if something good's happening at the surface. So the nerves and pathways that lead from these sensory receptors, so once again, we have a sensory neuron with sensory receptors. When there is a sensation modality, it causes a receptor potential that is depolarizing. If it depolarizes enough, then you're going to activate the afferent neuron, and then it'll project out. So most tactile sensory receptor input is conducted through A beta fibers and the dorsal column medial meniscal pathway. Your body wants to know in real time what's happening at the surface. Really wants to know, good and bad. Now there are some free nerve ending receptors that are associated with A delta, and there are some C fibers that, especially like tickle, these go up the anterolateral spinal thalamic. So for tactile sensation, it's primarily information going up the dorsal column medial meniscal pathway, but there is some backup. There is some backup with the anterolateral spinal thalamic pathway. Okay. Now, all I'm going to say right now for position, and we'll talk just a little bit about it later on, but we have position receptors in our joints and our skin and muscle spindles that tell the body in real time, are we moving? Are we out of position and risking equilibrium and falling? So the body wants to know, or your brain wants to know, what's the position of my body in space? How fast am I moving? Where am I? Why? It's trying to protect equilibrium and keep you from damaging the body and, most importantly, the head. So you need real-time input on position of the body. So you have these receptors throughout the body, on your skin, in your joints, and also in muscle spindles. So these give information on proprioception. And since you need this information very, very fast, if you begin to stumble, the body wants to know immediately what's going on so you can do an effective countermeasure. So the afferent limb of a reflex needs to be very, very fast so you can effect a rapid efferent countermeasure to correct your position and equilibrium. So not surprising, dorsal column medial meniscal pathways predominate for your position or proprioceptive senses. So not surprising if you have some disease process that starts to destroy neurons in the dorsal column, you lose some very important abilities. So we're talking about generally what happens, and later on we talk a little bit about what happens when things don't go well. We'll switch now to thermal sensation. Thermal sensation, it's quite a bit different. Thermal sensation is a dorsal column or is it anterolateral? It's anterolateral, that's right. So thermal information is taken in by at least 3 different types of thermal receptors. You have dedicated cold thermal receptors that are only activated when they experience cold. And they're associated with A delta nerve fibers. So they would conduct impulses about 10 meters per second. You have warmth thermal receptors. They're found on the ends of certain C fibers. And I should mention that just because we use A delta fibers for a lot of things. We'll see, we use A delta fibers for pain, we use A delta fibers for cold, we use A delta fibers for many different things. We use C fibers for many different things. Here we're just talking about warmth thermal receptors happen to be found on C nerve fibers. So A delta fibers, C fibers, and thermal sensation, it's going to go up the anterolateral spinal thalamic pathway. And there's a cold lane of that superhighway, there's a warmth lane where those neurons project. So there's also pain receptors. If you get to the extremely cold or extremely warm, you'll activate pain receptors. And this might not mean anything now, but these are primarily polymodal nociceptors found on seed fibers. So when you get to extremes of temperature, whether it's cold or hot, that causes tissue damage. That causes the activation of pain receptors. Now, thermal receptors, we all know they adapt. We've talked about sensory adaptation. They adapt. You step into a warm shower, it's hot, hot, hot. 30 seconds later, not so hot. A minute later, feels pretty good. Temperature of the water probably hasn't changed, but you've adapted to it. So they will respond fairly rapidly to temperature changes. Now, thermal receptors will adapt partially. There's a fast component and a slow component. Thermal receptors are far greater to rapid temperature change. So, you know, the air temp's 70 degrees, you step into a warm shower with water's 110, that's a very rapid temperature change. So you perceive it very, very rapidly. If you are in some, you know, this is several years ago, somebody said, okay, so if we change temperature very slowly, that adaptation is happening as we go. Yeah, that's right. So can we theoretically put a person in a tub of water and slowly raise the temperature, and they don't know it, and we boil them? Well, number one, you're kind of sick. Number two, no, that won't work, because when you get to the point where you're damaging tissues, the thermal pain receptors kick in. But it is very true. If you are put into an environment and the temperature changes very, very slowly, you don't notice it very, very much. You put a temperature probe on the back of somebody's skin, and you raise the temperature slowly, you don't notice it very much. And don't worry about this, but these are metaboreceptors, and that's what really activates them. So you can cross out C. Spatial summation is very important for recognizing temperature change. Like I mentioned earlier, if you would take a temperature probe, and yes, there are temperature probes like this, and you put it on the back of my hand, so a very small area of my skin, and that could be either very warm or very cold, and I'd go, it's different, but I can't tell you if it's hot or cold. It's different. But if you had a probe that's that size, and even if it's just a half a degree different, you'd go, that's warmer, that's cooler. That's because of spatial summation. Remember, spatial summation is different sensory activation coming in at the same time. So you have at least two sources of sensory information coming in at the same time. So spatial summation is very important for the discrimination of temperature change. So thermal sensation pathways, you'll note next time we get together, they're very similar to pain pathways. Bottom line, you can activate thermal receptors. That will then activate either an A delta or a C nerve fiber, depending if it's a cold or a warm thermal receptor. That's going to come in via dorsal spinal nerve roots. Sensory information from the periphery comes in via dorsal spinal nerve roots. There may be interneurons, I'll show you a picture, but it's going to go up the anterolateral spinal thalamic ascending pathway. And this is going to run to the reticular formation in the thalamus and then to the sensory cortex. So that, in words, is what the picture kind of says. So some things to notice, and there's very sparse innervation to the somatosensory cortex. You know that when you sense temperature, you tend to sense it in an area, not a specific site. So it's not surprising that it's kind of meager innervation of the somatosensory cortex, which gives us great sensory location. Here, there's a very small interneuron. When you have a small interneuron, you don't count it for number. This is still the first order neuron, second order neuron. What you do notice is with thermal sensation, you have a pretty good innervation of reticular formation, that wakefulness and arousal center. And also in that area, you have cardiovascular centers, respiratory centers, swallowing centers. So when you get a temperature change, are you suddenly more alert? Yes. And do you usually get a maybe get a heart rate change? Yes. Not surprising at all. Not surprising at all. I'd already mentioned cool air in your face. You're getting tired. You get a little cool air in your face, you're suddenly a little bit more invigorated. Or you splash cold water in your face, you're suddenly a little more invigorated. It doesn't just happen, it happens because of this. Activation of sensory receptors will activate the reticular formation. Now, some people then go, what about the mammalian diving reflex? These children go through the ice, and it actually slows down heart rate and metabolic activity tremendously when you get that cold water in the face. That's very true, but here we're talking about just a cold splash is actually activating, but if that rapid change in temperature to the face is prolonged, especially in children and in adults too to some degree, it'll actually decrease metabolic rate. It's built into us. Now this cool air in the face does a number of things because there's so many things built into the reticular formation. This is the reticular formation activation system. And when you get cool air in the face, you tend to take a deep breath. And it also decreases the sensation of wanting to vomit. And retching is the physical action. Vomiting is if something actually comes up. So very often, if somebody's feeling a little queasy, they need to go out and get a little bit of air. And they feel better. Splash a little water in your face, and you feel a little bit better. Why? Activation is reticular formation. Okay, so some places are very, very smart. You know, I talked about chefs using understanding of sensory neurophysiology in multiple course meals, so every course tastes absolutely fantastic. But I was at a meeting down in Orlando, and my wife and son went, and it was one of those meetings where I had to go in at 6 a.m. in the morning, and I never got home until night. So they went to all the different attractions, and they went on Mission Space. Can you go to meet Mission Space?
Just one of my, that's so funny. I don't ever throw up. I almost threw up on this ride.
Did you go on the green or the orange?
The orange.
Orange. What did you notice when you first got strapped in?
Puke bags.
Pardon me?
Puke bags.
Puke bags. Okay, that's what you first noticed. That, and this didn't have it turned up high enough for you, but as soon as you walk in, a fan turns on.
Yeah.
Blowing in your face.
Yeah.
They're trying to prevent you from using the puke bag.
It almost did.
So if that fan hadn't come on, you probably would have been using it.
Yeah, I thought I was going to.
So I was amazed, and I checked on it, and you get in there, and there's a number of rides in different places. You get in, cool air is streaming in your face, and it's trying to desensitize this retching center, which I think is brilliant. Which is brilliant. It's a lot easier to have a fan turn on than clean up Alex's mess, you know. So I'm glad, we're all glad you didn't have a reversal, as we sometimes say on these rides. So if you have something hot and burning, that also activates the reticular formation. And any of you know what that is? Nobody grew up on a farm?
I don't know if you guys say.
It's a hay hook for throwing small bales. And when I was in high school, I used to work for, I grew up in town. It was a town of 500. So according to all the farmers, I was one of those city kids, you know. And I worked for different farmers, and we'd spend the summer throwing hay bales. And they weren't ergonomically correct. And so one year I decided to take shop class. Not have so many classes in high school, so I was going to make a special hay hook that was fit, the right angles and so forth. So you heat metal in the forge, and you bend it, and you sharpen it, and so forth. And I was getting better and better and better. And one day I show up in the shop class, and there's a place where the rods of iron are there, and I reached in and grabbed a rod of iron, and immediately I heard something. I looked down, you know, it's like something's frying. I looked down immediately, and there's steam billowing out of my hands. And so I heard it and I saw it, and only then I noticed the sensation. And it was neither hot nor cold. It was just like, well, first thing I thought was, this is ice cold. Guy from the earlier period didn't put it into the hot bin, he put it in the cold bin, and I grabbed something that was, and when you get about 1400 degrees, it's no longer cherry red, it's this dull color. So I couldn't tell what temperature it was, didn't feel pain at the time, but when I realized and I tried to get it out of my hand, it was stuck, because it was kind of frying shut, and I threw it out like that, then I felt pain. Then I felt pain. The moral of the story was, sight, A alpha, very, very fast. Hearing, A alpha. Pain, it's slower fibers. But I could not tell, because it was so extreme, I couldn't tell it was hot or cold. It literally felt cold. And it was like 1,000, well, way more than 1,000 degrees beyond cold. But you'll notice, not a scar, not a scar. I had enough sweat on my hands, and I was just boiling that off. I did tear up my hand quite a bit. But thermal sensation, was I wide awake? I was wide awake for 2 days. So get working on chapter 12. It's a big, big, big chapter, the cardiovascular chapter. Starting this weekend, really, really, really good chapter 12 down. We'll talk about pain next time, and then motor spasms.